clear that the Republican Party is in crisis as the country becomes more diverse. The party hasn't adapted like the progressives. I mean, after all, the progressives stand for progress, right? Just like liberals stand for liberty. Democratic darling Debbie Wasserman Schultz praises liberals for continuing to break race barriers.
Take a good look when the House convenes after this next Congress is sworn in at what our side of the aisle looks like versus the Republican side of the aisle. I mean, they got whiter and more male, and we now have a majority, minority, and female Democratic caucus. First time in history.
Well, it's good to know that language is acceptable now. If I didn't know any better, or if I only watched MSNBC, I would think the Republican Party is made up of a bunch of old, rich, selfish, racist white men. Just look at this headline from Politico. Election aftermath. GOP soul-searching. Too old, too white, too male. Then you've got conservative old white male in former Governor Mike Huckabee blaming the Republicans for doing a, quote, pathetic job of reaching out to people of color. Well, actually, Mike Huckabee, if you mean the party hasn't resorted to pandering, then you're right. And by the way, I think you're one of the good guys. Why should we have to pander? Conservatives stand for the Constitution. It's the framework of our country and our freedoms. If people don't like it, well, that's too bad. Why should we have to apologize for that? So here's a thought. If Republicans don't like to associate themselves with the word conservative, then I'll start calling us preservatives instead. Here's why. We want to preserve the Constitution. We want to preserve freedom. We want to preserve the free market. Is there anything wrong with that? So in order to move forward, as our progressive friends would say, we need to understand what the party was built on and how we can preserve our values. So to quote Politico, let's do some GOP soul searching over the next hour. Let's talk about the history of the party and how conservative values and the conservative movement evolved over time. Republicans never use history to their advantage, while the Democrats have amnesia, kind of like Romnesia. But actually, the left likes to push their sparkly, all-inclusive, tolerant history of the party, which dates back all the way to 1968. Let me welcome on guests Brion McClanahan, author and historian and columnist for townhall.com, Ayesha Kreutz, New York chapter president of the Frederick Douglass Foundation, and Reverend C.L. Bryant, former NAACP president and creator of Runaway Slave. Well, I think we have to focus on the 100 years between 1868 and 1968. So let's put up a banner which represented, this is actually a historic banner of the 1868 Democratic Party campaign motto. Let's take a look at that. So, 1868. What year was Frederick Douglass's name entered into nomination to be Vice President of the United States?
1868.
1868. So, 1868, the Democrats were claiming this is a white man's country and that white men should rule, and the Republicans entered in Frederick Douglass's name for Vice President. How is it that Republicans can't use that in their history?
Well, they can. They just don't.
That's a short and sweet answer. They can, they don't.
Yeah.
It's one of the things that should be plastered on the GOP. You know, the RNC, one of the first things that you go on there is we have a long, strong, rich history, and it's nowhere on the site. So when people go to see any of those facts that are out there about our history as Republicans.
It's amazing, Andrew, how Republicans do the best job at running away from what made this country great, and it was Republican principles, the free market system, leave us alone, the laissez-faire attitude, fiscal responsibility. And it was in 1870, just 2 years after Frederick Douglass's name was entered into nomination for VP, that Republicans elected the very first congressman to the House and the first senator to the Senate. They were black. Very first ones in 1870. It was 64 years before Democrats did that, and nearly 130 years before they elected their first senator, Democrats. Republicans need to let this story be told. They also need to let this story be told, that it was Richard Nixon and Dwight Eisenhower who actually presented the first civil rights bill in 1957, and John Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson voted against it.
We're going to get into all that. Brian, does this frustrate you as a historian? I mean, these are the facts. This is the stuff that maybe you don't get in the public school system, but this is the truth.
Well, sure. I mean, anytime you look at the Republican Party, of course, the Republican Party founded in 1854 was one of their major campaign planks was anti-slavery extension of the territory. So, yeah, I mean, often this isn't talked about, at least the way it should be. And, of course, it's the same Republican Party. Nothing's changed. Many people call it the Party of Lincoln, and, of course, attaching that party, the current Republican Party, to Abraham Lincoln, I think could go a long way in helping push this message. But, you know, it's not just Lincoln. It's Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens and a whole host of other Republicans at the time who were definitely pushing a pro-civil rights agenda. In fact, the Republican Party attempted many times in the 1860s and 70s to have a civil rights agenda, civil rights legislation. And of course, it was later overturned by the Supreme Court. But yeah, I mean, it is frustrating if you look at that to say that, you know, we have amnesia, as you said. We're only talking about the Democrats in 40 years of history or so, and they think that they can control the agenda. But if the Republicans go back to the 1850s, I mean, by far they have the longest track record for a pro-civil rights agenda of both parties.
And before I bring it back to the panel here in New York, I mean, James Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers about his discomfort with slavery. So this goes back even further when we rewrite the history of the Founding Fathers. He said a man can't be property and a man at the same time, because how do you apply the rule of law to him? So this is not something that was absent in the founding of this country as well.
Well, absolutely not. I mean, and I think the term Republican actually more accurately describes those of us who call ourselves conservative than conservative. I mean, we are Republicans with a lowercase r. And many of the Republicans in the founding generation, you mentioned James Madison, but also Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, they all called themselves Republicans because it was that Republican simplicity and that devotion to limited government and, of course, you know, individualism that defined that founding generation. And, you know, Jefferson and Madison were both, at one point in their career, uncomfortable with slavery, and many Southerners were because they were around it on a regular basis. Jefferson, of course, became you know, much more quiet on the issue as he got older, as he advanced in age. He definitely wasn't someone who was anti-slavery, but he did try to include, actually, in the Declaration of Independence, a clause that blamed the institution of slavery on the king. So, and it was rejected by South Carolina, but I mean, many of these members of the founding generation, both North and South, were uncomfortable with the issue of slavery, and so Republicanism should be something that we're talking about quite extensively in America today.
And before we get into modern history, I'm going to go to 1955 when we come back from the break, but when did Frederick Douglass become de-linked from the Republican Party? If you were to go up to Frederick Douglass Boulevard, right uptown here in New York City, and stand under the street sign with a clipboard and ask people as they walk by, which political party do you think Frederick Douglass was a member of? I think you know the answer you're going to get. How did that happen?
Well, I think it was probably in the 60s, I think when we emerged out of, you know, out of the Vietnam War. I think it gave a great opportunity for the Democrat Party to be able to rewrite their history, but as well because you had, with Martin Luther King Jr., when Kennedy was able to secure his release, it was, you know, Kennedy did a brilliant political move in that, you know, at that point. You know, he said, hey, you know, I'll get you released, you come and help try and fight for us. And I think after you got out of the Vietnam War, that is the thing that let them kind of wiggle around and, oh, we'll just forget all of that other stuff because we had so many other things going on in play in the Republican Party. I don't think, because we don't classify people, you know, you're not black, you're not white, you know what I mean? That's not how we think. We're just like, okay, freedom, liberty, it's something that we all believe in. But now that our education system is just an indoctrination system,
So corrupt.
then, you know, all of those things have fallen away, you know. But if,
We'll come back, we'll do this after the break. Brian, Ayesha, CL, stay right there. More perfectly executed political analysis after the break. Now, tonight's daily digit is 0. That is the number of Republican segregationist governors. Now, before the break, we were talking about Frederick Douglass and how he has been delinked throughout history with the Republican Party. I'm back with Brion McClanahan, Ayesha Kreutz, and C.L. Bryant. So let's pick up right there. If we were to go up to Frederick Douglass Boulevard right here in New York City with a clipboard and ask people what political party they think Frederick Douglass was a member of, we know what answer would be given. Pick up your thought. How did that happen? After the late 1960s, where do we go from there?
Well, Republicans dropped the ball. They, I don't think
not claiming their own history.
Not claiming their own history. I don't think that they allowed for what was happening in the black community, from the women's movement, the feminist movement, the breakup of the family. You had all of these different things that were coming in and converging all at once, and end of slavery. So now blacks had a lot more freedom at that time. So feminist movement, Vietnam War, the other end of it, you had freedom, and then you had the Republican Party who just was like, oh, everything is great, look, everything's coming together, and they just moved on, and they didn't hold on to or claim that. And of course, the liberals are great at propaganda, and they decided to claim that, and they own the education system. So if you don't combat that somehow, then of course, they can teach whatever they want. When you hear about Frederick Douglass within even the education system today, they never say, oh, he was a Democrat or Republican. They just conveniently leave it out. So you can assume with the climate that we have today in today's political propaganda that he would be a Democrat. But everybody
should know he's a Republican.
Should know that he's a Republican. We have some Frederick Douglass places all where I'm from in Rochester, and everybody thinks that he's a Democrat. But once you bring it out, they're like, oh, I didn't know that.
Well, before we go back to Bryant, I want to go to 1955, Emmett Till. This is almost 10 years before what we know is the beginning of the civil rights movement. Emmett Till was a young boy. He was accused of whistling at a white woman. Mm-hmm. He was found a few days later in the Tallahatchie River with a desk fan, tied to his neck by barbed wire. Right. His family made the choice to have an open casket funeral. The front page photograph of his mangled body, it horrified the nation.
Right.
I did some really crazy research. There was not one elected Republican, state, local, federal, in the state of Mississippi in 1955. But Republicans get blamed for segregation. Sure. They get blamed for racism. 1957, the first filibuster of the civil rights legislation, and then you have Dwight D. Eisenhower. 1964, civil rights legislation filibustered by Al Gore's father, Bill Clinton's political mentor, William Fulbright, and Robert Byrd, who became the conscience of the Senate.
And if it had not been for a Republican senator from Illinois, Everett Dirksen,
that's right.
There would not have been a civil rights bill or voting act. These things are conveniently left out of history. Martin Luther King, at the time of his death, was a Republican. Most people, that's left out of history.
Francis Rice told me that straight up.
That's left out of history as well. During the 60s, the mid to late 60s, there was a move to victimize, or at least put that type of mentality into the mindset of Black America. It was a move to make them feel as though they were owed something. Truly, we have been through a history of being abused from the slavery in this country. But where does that stop? Where does that victimization mindset stop? And how long will the Democrats continue to use that as a tool to keep a certain group of people on the plantation? Walson and Schultz talking about how many black folks the Democrats
tried to run out Allen West.
Oh yeah.
Let me bring in Brian here. I mean, here we are talking history, and again, Brian, we're not giving opinion, we're not revising history, we're not making stuff up as it would be. You're a historian, you're in media. How is it, as I asked Ayesha, how does this stuff get delinked and lost in the annals of history?
Well, I think it all started basically in the 1960s. It's already been said. I think you had a politicization of history, and that's not uncommon. All historians have biases. It's just that many people aren't open to exposing their biases. So, around the 1960s and the civil rights movement and forward, even in the 50s when this stuff started being discussed, you had a re-examination, a revisionist push in history to try to portray, paint American history in a different light. And I think what's happened over time is that people generally just start to assume that because you're a person who's for civil rights, then all those people would have been Democrats, and anyone who's against it would be Republican, because, of course, nowadays the red states are primarily in the South and the West, and the blue states are in the North. So I think that's when people look at the map, they think, well, everything's flipped. Well, as I said earlier, the Republican Party hasn't changed. It might have a broader base to it in the South than it ever had. There were no Republicans really in the 1950s and 60s in the South, outside of the African American community. That started changing in the late 60s. But really, it's because you have these historians with a particular agenda that want to try to push that, and that becomes part of the American textbook system, and then, of course, that gets pushed into the public education system.
Well, and I just wanted to, when you look at even like with the Dixiecrats, when we're talking about revising history, out of the 26 known Dixiecrats, only 3 of them became Republican.
And
all the rest of them, that's right. That's right. And all the rest of them went back to the Democrat Party. But the only people that they ever talk about are Strong, Thurman, usually, are the 3 that went to Republicans. But nobody ever talks about the other 23 that went back to being Democrats.
Right.
And that, I mean, the Republican Party has to own that. Why aren't we out there talking about those things and saying, hold on, there's something going on here. You guys are trying to portray us as, until you get mad at your character, like people assassinating your character by calling you a racist.
And then the third party idea with George, we forget about George Wallace,
George,
who was a Democrat, who wanted to become a Republican, but realized the Republican Party didn't want him in the party. And so he created a third party.
Right.
And it was George Wallace who stood in the doorway, a Democrat of the University of Alabama, to block blacks from coming in. But it was Eisenhower, a Republican president, who sent the National Guard into Little Rock so the Little Rock Nine could go to school. So we have this history as Republicans that we are running away from. And we don't have to try and pander to anyone. We just need to tell our story.
Well, we're going to have a video clip in a little bit of a Southern black Republican versus a Northern white progressive that's going to make your head explode. Let's leave it there. Bryant, Ayesha, CL. We'll pick it up after the break. More Wilkow next.
Black student in every black college in America to be out there in the middle of every fight? The answer is no. So for you to say, why was I sitting on the sidelines? I think that is an inaccurate deduction that you are trying to make. You didn't know, Lawrence, what I was doing with the rest of my life. You didn't know what my family situation may have been.
That was the clip I told you about before the break. MSNBC's Lawrence O'Donnell questioning Herman Cain. It was, if you watch the whole exchange, it was disgusting. This is what conservatives are subjected to when they don't play nice with the liberal media. I'm back with Brion McClanahan, Ayesha Kreutz, and C.L. Bryant. That got completely ignored. Basically, Lawrence O'Donnell said, you're not really black, you're a coward, you set up the civil rights movement, when Herman Cain is a Southern black Republican from Atlanta who experienced discrimination to become one of America's prominent CEOs and businessmen. Isn't he the person that we're supposed to be using as the example when we teach all students about who to be in life?
Absolutely, Andrew. And growing up black in the South during that period in time, I lived through that era. I'm just a few years younger than my friend Herman, and of course, he's in our movie. But the thing is, in the South during that period in time, I remember Negro Day at the fair in Louisiana, when there was one day out of a 2-week run where black people could go to the state fair there. And for somebody like Lawrence O'Donnell to challenge a black man who grew up in those times is totally off the radar as to how he has that type of gall to do that type of thing.
I can't even think of the laundry list of words that are used in the wrong context. You get beaten to death. You get bludgeoned by the left-wing media. That was not insulting to me personally, but wouldn't that normally be framed as insulting if a white conservative spoke to a black progressive like that?
Absolutely. You'd probably lose your job.
Yeah.
If you went off and did
People
something
have been fired
like
for
that.
less.
For a lot less. But I think that's just the cult, that's what people have come to expect because, again, you've allowed the narrative You know, we have been on the defensive for so long as Republicans, you know, and especially white Republicans, have been on the defensive for so long that I think they're used to playing the defense. You know, they wait for something to happen and then they react versus saying, hold on, I'm going to take this, and we can win this by taking it to the media, which I think you guys do a great job of doing, is saying we're not going to allow you to do that and put them on the defensive. And if we can do that, then we can win this battle in the media, especially because we live in a culture today where it's all sound bites. The kids want to watch, you know, something on TV. If they're watching the news, it's usually not, you know, Fox News or something like that because, you know, they have cable. You're lucky.
Well, Brian, you know, think about this. I mean, here we are in new media, literally doing the job that the media is supposed to be doing. They refuse to, I guess, hold people like Lawrence O'Donnell accountable. He's part of the mainstream media. Would you pick up right there with the 1960s saying the new media that we're seeing today began in the 1960s as the baby boomer kids were graduating from journalism school?
Well, I think so. I mean, you know, as this agenda, again, from the 50s forward, people start to get this stuff in college education, you know, college courses, whether it's history or whatever they're taking. I think, of course, then they're going to start moving into the media, into the mainstream media. The great thing about new media is that it allows us to expose these kind of things. I mean, so when you have the internet, which is a great source, and you have things like Blaze TV and other places to actually have a dissenting voice, it allows for this stuff to get out there. And it's unfortunate that you're combating, and actually this is brought up, all we really have is, you know, talk radio and the internet. The mainstream media covers so many other avenues, and it's unfortunate that people think, you know, you want to try to shut that down because that's the one place or two places you can go to hear the other side. But yeah, I mean, definitely the 60s generation taking part and becoming the leaders of this you know, media empire that we have in the mainstream media. I mean, it plays a role in this.
All right, I want to go into CL's wheelhouse real quick. Religion, the Constitution, First Amendment, free speech, freedom of religion. The churches, by and large, were abolitionist.
Right.
Fast forward again, 1868, 1968, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Somewhere along the way, we shifted from I Have a Dream to Al Sharpton. So when did that happen?
I Have a Dream, Andrew, became I Have a Scheme. I have a scheme to co-opt a group of people. You know that I'm formerly the president of the NAACP in Garland, Texas.
It was in the intro.
One of the reasons that I left the organization was that a light came on. They not only wanted to control the agenda, I realized they wanted to control me, and then use me to control a group of people. The church is strangely missing, and especially the pastor, black pastor, and as I've been a Tea Party and across this country, I see pastors missing in action altogether. And matter of fact, if the church had stood up back in the 1860s and said, hey, this slavery thing is wrong, there might not have been a reason for the Civil War. And the church is missing now in this fight that we are trying to wage to preserve the Republic. If the church en masse would stand up and say, listen, we're turning the Republic into a nanny state, there might not be a need for this type of civil war that's about to occur in our country.
What's the point of bringing that? Well, if you're going to put them right back into a different form of bondage. Now, let me ask you, have you faced, you are with a, I guess, a politically unpopular to the progressives organization, the Frederick Douglass Foundation. You were speaking eloquently about white Republicans, black Republicans, there's no real color, there's just a party and all these things. What have you faced with this?
Well, you know, I think it's how you present it. You know, we are well received, I'll be honest, but it's because you have
well received with progressives?
Sure.
Like on college kid, really?
Sure. Because you have, I mean, again, I don't let myself be bullied, though. You know,
Well, I don't think Herman Cain was letting himself be bullied.
Well,
I think that was a job to be done by Lawrence O'Donnell.
Right, but I'm not on the media, right, I'm not also, you know, I mean, when you have a one-on-one relationship with someone, it's a lot different than going on a media situation, I think. But if you go, you know, these liberals, when, you know, we're on a college campus, and, you know, they'll start getting a little, talking out the side of their neck a little bit, but I know my history. I am educated, that I can say, oh, really, you know, what about the government plantation that you're putting my people on? That today, the way that the Democrats today, right, they're now the party of socialism. They were KKK, slavery, segregation, and now socialism. And you want to say that the black family being 70% born out of wedlock, when in the 60s we were 24% born out of wedlock, that the way that the system keeps it so that women don't get married, right? So that they're dependent on the government. Why aren't we as Republicans turning around and saying, hey, we're not trying to take away your benefits. Actually, we want to incentivize you.
Work.
That's right. We want to incentivize you in order to stay in a two-parent home so that your kids aren't in poverty, so that you have generational wealth. If you start talking like that to these guys, they have nowhere to go. So then I have a ground, you know, there's a messaging thing that does happen where I know how to talk to them because I was one of them. I was a Democrat. I was able to diffuse and cross over.
Well, before we wrap this up, Brian, soft bigotry of low expectations, I think that's one of the great quotes from George W. Bush, regardless of where you are with him politically. Do you think that's the way Republicans should frame these programs and this treatment of minorities heading into the future?
Well, sure. I mean, I think that one thing we could do, you know, one of the great leaders of the African-American community in the South for years was Booker T. Washington. They had a great statement, you know, cast down your buckets where you are. You know, you talk about all the issues that we have today, and he talked about opportunity. And you know, this is wonderful that this is being discussed tonight, because you know, one of the things that could be appealing to the African-American community would be opportunity. I mean, you look at Booker T. Washington and what he started with. The guy walked across the state of Virginia to go to college and had to sweep a floor for his college entrance exam, then became one of the leaders of the black community in Alabama. And he said, look, what we need to do is look around. We have white and black Southerners who have lived together for hundreds of years, you know, 200 years at that point. We need to cast down our buckets where we are, and I think that could be a popular message today. You know, here we are, confronting these issues of things like immigration and other issues like that, and you have a number of people out there who would be willing to work and do things and have opportunity. Well, look, let's push that message, and I think that's something that if you start talking about individual opportunity and freedom and things like that, I mean, those are things that are appealing to anyone regardless of race, and I think that's where the Republican message could be appealing to the broad American political spectrum.
All right, Bryant, Ayesha, CL, thank you so much for joining in tonight. Next, we'll talk about how conservatives could afford to take a page out of the liberal playbook and start messaging better. We're right, they're wrong. More Wilkow after the break.